January 17, 1943. A cold night settles over a U.S. air warning station on the North African coast. The wind moves in long, steady breaths, rattling the canvas lining of the operations hut. Inside, a faint glow pulses from a single circular screen. Radar scope hits green sweep, cutting through the darkness like a silent heartbeat. The room smells of dust, warm wiring, and the metallic scent of equipment pushed past its limits. Every few seconds, the low hum of the generator deepens, vibrating through the floorboards outside. Nothing seems unusual. The desert is quiet, the sky unbroken. To any observer, the night appears safe, empty, wide. But to the young operators, standing over the screen, something else is beginning to form. A cluster, then two, then five. Shapes emerging in the static, faint but deliberate. Moving in a way only machines could move. On paper, these men were simply technicians. Too many German officers, they were nothing more than radio watchers with oversized headphones. Yet here, in this dim hut, they were becoming the first line of defense watchers of the unseen. The sweep turns again. Brighter this time, tracing the path that would soon rewrite expectations. And with that arc of green light begins the story behind the collapse of a night raid. Asterisk. The early months of 1943, the war had entered a new phase. One defined not by daylight clashes, but by the shadows that fell after dusk. German commanders still believed that night operations belonged to them. Years of experience over Europe had reinforced this confidence. Darkness, masked bomber formations, concealed fighter approaches, and allowed raiders to slip past traditional observation posts. Before radar, night meant safety. Night meant opportunity. In North Africa, this belief persisted. The Luftwaffe, though strained, still carried the memory of its early war dominance. Many German officers viewed American forces as late arrivals, brave but inexperienced, technologically capable, yet untested under real pressure. They considered the U.S. radar program primitive, secondary branch of communication rather than a decisive element of war. Some even wrote in reports that American early warning crews could not interpret what they observed, dismissing them as operators who see ghosts in static. Yet the war had changed faster than old assumptions could keep pace. The United States, learning from both British experience and its own rapid industrial mobilization, had begun deploying a network of SCR-series radar sets across forward positions. These systems were not flawless. They suffered from heat drift, occasional calibration failures, the unpredictable interference of coastal weather, but they offered something revolutionary, the ability to see what the human eye could not. While German pilots trusted darkness to conceal them, U.S. radar crews had started to treat night as an ally. Each sweep of the screen revealed patterns that operators learned to read like language: range rings, bearing lines, movement clusters. Every shift told a story. By early 1943, this quiet mastery had begun shaping the air war. What appeared to German raiders as an untouched coastline was, in truth, watched by a chain of stations connected through radios, signal posts, and interceptor commands. A system designed not for spectacle, but for precision. And as these stations grew in reliability, they prepared the ground for a confrontation that would challenge everything the Luftwaffe believed about night superiority. Asterisk. Across the expanding American foothold in North Africa, radar was no longer an experimental tool, it was becoming a disciplined craft. The -270 Seychelles rupees, the same early warning set that had detected Japanese aircraft approaching Oahu in 1941, now stood in new positions overlooking the Mediterranean approaches. Alongside it operated the SCR 5-7 and -271 Seychelles rupees, adapted for shorter range, control, and more stable performance in forward areas. Together, they formed a layered net, extending far beyond what German planners assumed possible. These stations were manned by teams who had trained not for glamour. Radar instruction schools in the United States had pushed recruits through long nights of simulated interceptions, mechanical troubleshooting, and mathematical drills. Many were barely in their 20s, Yet they carried one responsibility: provide information with absolute clarity. The war had shown that a single misread blip could mean a squadron lost, convoy exposed, or a city struck without warning. But the enemy knew little of this preparation. German assessments of American air warning capability were based on limited encounters from 1942, when U.S. units were still inexperienced. Reports circulated in Luftwaffe headquarters claiming that Anglo-American radar requires fixed installations and daylight calibration, implying significant limitations. These conclusions convinced many officers that night-raiding American positions would remain feasible. They did not account for the rapid pace of U.S. adaptation. Radar. Vance had been fitted with better cooling systems to survive the desert heat. Operators had grown skilled at filtering out sandstorm interference. Interceptor squadrons, once struggling to coordinate with ground stations, now practiced continuous drills. Fighters launched on command, turning radar signals into precise altitude and bearing interceptions. By mid-January, Luftwaffe reconnaissance misread quiet radar huts as signs of inactivity. They saw dim lights, low structures, no obvious display of strength. They assumed complacency. What they were actually observing was readiness quiet, disciplined and attuned to the invisible movements of aircraft far beyond the horizon. This convergence of preparation, technology, and underestimated skill set. The stage for a confrontation that would reveal how dramatically the balance had shifted. Asterisk, the first angle begins with the people behind the screens. Ordinary Americans transformed into guardians of the night. Their stations were small, their equipment modest, yet each operator carried the weight of an entire sector's safety. They lived in a world where battles were measured not by explosions, but by faint streaks of light crawling across a radar scope. Fatigue was constant. The night hum of machinery replaced sleep, and isolation became routine. But their discipline never wavered. They learned to trust the quiet signals on the screen more than the darkness beyond the hut. Every blip mattered. Every sweep told them that someone somewhere was approaching. To the pilots they guided, these operators became an unseen lifeline. Tactical success increasingly depended on the coordination between radar stations and interceptor commands. When a formation appeared 90 miles out, the ground controllers assigned headings, altitudes, and timing. When the signal intensified, fighters were scrambled. When the cluster moved inland, pursuit began. Every interception was the result of a chain of decisions built from silent information. This dependence on invisible guidance marked a profound shift in air warfare. For the Germans, night raids had once been shaped around human senses: listening, watching, navigating by dim moonlight or coastline glow. But radar changed that rhythm. The Americans no longer defended blindly. They anticipated. Interceptors rose into the night with purpose, not guesswork. Darkness ceased to protect the raiders and instead revealed their paths to the men watching the scope. And within this system emerged a pattern. The stronger the radar understanding became, the more predictable German tactics seemed, turning former advantages into vulnerabilities. Asterisk, the second set of angles centers on technology, perception, and the quiet, ideological weight behind a glowing radar screen. At the heart of the American advantage was not just the machinery itself, but the culture that surrounded it. Radar, in U.S. hands, became a symbol of organized abundance and application of industry, training, and democratic coordination. Each station drew power from a logistical system capable of delivering parts, fuel, cables, and replacement tubes across oceans. Every functioning screen reflected the industrial depth behind it, a depth the Axis often underestimated. Technologically, the SCR series sets were far from perfect. They offered something the Germans lacked in the same scale: reliable long-range early warning integrated into fighter command networks. German crews, trained to trust darkness, entered raids assuming surprise. But their reliance on past success blinded them to how quickly the Americans had adapted. Reports later indicated that many Luftwaffe officers believed early U.S. radar units could only track large formations or could be confused by altitude changes. They were confident the Americans remained a step behind, yet each night told a different story. Operators learned to read the signatures of German aircraft wind and gen echoes, formation spacing, speed relative to coastline winds. They recognized these patterns as clearly as if they were spoken instructions. With every raid, U.S. forces refined the language of detection, while German crews continued flying under outdated assumptions. From an ideological perspective, the radar screen itself became a symbol, its steady rotation, a reminder of a system built on cooperation rather than fear. It represented a society capable of mobilizing knowledge, training thousands to master complex tasks, and trusting them with critical decisions. This quiet, methodical strength stood in contrast to the rigid expectations of their opponents, and it was this divergence that would soon collide in a single night when overconfidence met preparation. The turning point arrived on a moonless night in late January 1943, when a concentrated Luftwaffe formation, due to 17s, supported by Ru. 88s moved across the Mediterranean with the intent of crippling newly established American supply positions. Near the Algerian coast, German planners believed the raid would achieve complete surprise. Their intelligence notes suggested that U.S. radar remained inconsistent during hours of temperature inversion, when warm air above cool ground could bend signals and mask distant aircraft. They expected the Americans to detect nothing until bombs began to fall, but the radar huts were already awake shortly after 22 o'clock hours. The sweep of -270 Seychelles rupees began catching faint, rhythmic returns far beyond the range German officers believed possible. Operators watched the cluster stabilize, then multiply. They calculated speed, consistent with twin-engine bombers. They checked bearing, approaching from the north-northeast. Interceptor Command received the report before the enemy. Formation crossed 85 miles. Fighters were scrambled while the blips still moved over open water within minutes. Ground controllers issued precise vectors, guiding the interceptors into a convergence pattern designed to strike the formation at the moment it descended toward its attack altitude. The Germans continued inward, unaware that their position was no longer secret. By the time they realized their approach had been compromised, the night sky ahead of them was already shifting, growing teeth, gaining shape. Collision was moments away. The interception unfolded with a precision the Luftwaffe had not anticipated. At 20 to 41 hours, as the German formation began its descent toward the coastline, first group of U.S. fighters P-38s adapted for night operations, cut through the darkness with directional confidence seldom seen in earlier months. They were not searching. They were meeting a calculated point in space anticipated minutes earlier by radar crews who had tracked every mile of the formation's advance. The German bombers, accustomed to slipping past defenses unnoticed, were suddenly confronted by aircraft emerging from the black sky at exact angles. Their tight formation fractured almost immediately. Pilots who once relied on night's concealment now found themselves exposed in a darkness that no longer hid them. Reports from surviving crews later described the shock they had expected: confusion, erratic opposition, or inaccurate interception. Instead, they faced fighters positioned with uncanny accuracy attack runs that began at the perfect altitude. From the precise bearing that radar operators had relayed to the controllers, on the ground, within minutes, the raid's structure collapsed. Due to 17s broke formation, Ru-88s attempted evasive maneuvers, and bombs intended for American ports fell harmlessly into open water. Interceptors pursued relentlessly, guided by continued updates from the glowing scopes back at the station. 4. The Luftwaffe, the night which had once been an ally, became an unfamiliar battlefield, one where every turn, every climb, every moment of hesitation was already anticipated by men they had dismissed, and as the surviving bombers fled toward the sea, the implications of what had occurred began to take shape. By midnight, the scattered remnants of the German formation were retreating across the Mediterranean, their cohesion broken and their mission failed. American ground stations documented the event with clinical clarity. Early detection at long range, accurate tracking, coordinated interception, and decisive disruption of the raid. For the first time in this sector, the Luftwaffe's long-held assumption that night guaranteed. Its prize had been conclusively overturned. Loss reports. gathered over the next 24 hours confirmed the scale of the collapse. Several bombers were missing, others damaged, and none had struck their intended targets. German officers reviewing the outcome struggled to reconcile the precision of the American response with their existing intelligence assessments. Their internal memos cited unexpected coordination, improved early warning, and interceptors positioned in exact proximity. What had been considered improbable's radar guiding fighters into perfect alignment had unfolded with undeniable clarity. For the Americans, the night brought more than tactical success. It validated months of training, adjustment, and patient refinement. And it made clear that the quiet hum of a radar set had grown into one of the war's most transformative instruments. Asterisk in the weeks that followed. German analysis teams attempted to identify the source of their failure. They examined navigation logs, weather reports, and crew testimonies, searching for any indication that the Americans had deployed new aircraft or ground observers. Only gradually did they acknowledge the true cause: radar crews who had mastered their craft faster and more effectively than expected. Internal Luftwaffe notes from early February emphasized a growing concern American. Early warning systems were no longer a peripheral threat, but a fully integrated defensive network. For us commanders, the night became a case study. Interceptor squadrons refined their coordination, ground crews improved antenna calibration schedules, and operators expanded their catalog of aircraft signatures. The system that had defeated one raid now stood ready for many more. Improvement widened the gap between expectation and reality for future German operations. Even more telling was the shift in perception among Axis crews, where once they had mocked the Americans' technological inexperience, they now approached the coastline with caution, knowing that silence no longer promised safety. The green sweep of an unseen radar screen had become a quiet force altering the balance of the night. Asterisk in the months after that January night, the glow of the radar screen became more than an instrument. It became a symbol of a changing war. Steady rotation marked the rhythm of a new reality, one in which technology, training, and quiet persistence reshaped the balance between offense and defense. The Luftwaffe, once confident in the shadows, could no longer rely on darkness. And the Americans, once dismissed as inexperienced, began shaping the night with an authority earned not through spectacle, but through discipline. For the young operators, in their dim huts, the experience carried a deeper meaning. They had not fought with the fire of engines or the recoil of guns. They fought with observation, with the ability to read faint traces on a circular screen and turn them into decisions that shaped the sky. Their work revealed a truth often overlooked in warfare: power can rest in silence as much as in sound. The radar screen's soft glow, its unwavering sweep, represented a kind of confidence rooted in preparation rather than bravado. That green arc of light, persistent, impartial, always returning, echoed the larger ideals the United States brought into the war. It reflected a system built on coordination, shared responsibility, and the belief that knowledge could safeguard lives. It stood as a quiet contrast to the rigid structures their opponents relied upon, where the Axis placed faith in hierarchy. In boldness, the Americans placed faith in networks, in logistics, in the collective skill of thousands working toward a single purpose, and in that contrast lay the heart of the transformation. The defeat of a night raid was not simply a tactical victory, it was a moment when expectation yielded to reality, when confidence faltered in the face of preparation, and when the invisible became decisive. Long after the desert winds swept over, the abandoned radar stations, the memory of that glowing screen, remained a reminder that in the vast darkness of war, even the faintest signal can carry the weight of a nation's resolve.